So, a very good morning. It's a real honor to replace a famous name in the EEG monitoring world and in the neuroscience world. And I do not want to give the impression that I'm going to be fully replacing him as he's really a world expert on his domain. But I thought, well, I can give you an overview of the current evolutions that are currently going on in interpreting EEG. Because we all know that we use EEG monitoring for some time now. There are simplified indices who have a correlation with our drug doses, especially the hypnotic effective drug doses are translated in a single number. Of course, this is an extreme simplification, and over the last decades, there was progress in a better understanding of the neuroscience and a better translation of what the meaning is of this EEG signal. And so I'm going to take you with me on several evolutions in the world of EEG interpretation, of which I'm convinced that in the near future, maybe within the next 10 years, there will be a lot of change in the next 10 years, that maybe there will be some clinical tools available that implement these technologies. So I have some conflicts of interest to declare because the department of anesthesia where I work receives educational and research grants from several medical companies. We also often get free EEG machines and electrodes to use in the studies that we performed. I have no personal counseling fees or shares or other personal financial interests in EEG monitoring technology, but I have a very high personal interest in the mechanisms of anesthetic drugs and how it can be measured. I received the kind permission of Professor Patrick Burden and Professor Emery Brown to use a large part of their slides. They have a very interesting educational website which is freely available, and you can log in on it. And it's a 3-hour course that has CME credits, and it's very interesting to learn about the complexity of EEG. So I take you through the EEG. The EEG is in fact electrical activity, which is generated by the brain. And the brain, the top part of the brain is the cortex, and it contains a lot of bipolar structures, neural networks that give an electrical current, a voltage potency. And this is collected if you have a reference electrode for all the locations on the brain, you can capture that electrical signal. This is, of course, the basics. And this electrical signal at first glance is very chaotic, or seems very chaotic, but and just for understanding it better, it has been arbitrarily divided in a summation of more sinusoidal waveforms. I'm sorry. So if you divide the EEG wave into separate structures, you can identify high frequency waves, which are called the gamma band. There are more slow wave between 12 and 24.5 Hertz, which is called the beta waves. Alpha waves, which are between 8 to 12 Hertz, and the theta waves, which are more slow waves but high voltage. And when you approach the burst suppression level, where you have a flat EEG, you also distinguish this very slow wave, which is sometimes below 1 Hertz. Now, this feature is a typical feature for during excessive anesthesia. It is small phases of burst and high voltage activity, high frequency often, followed by flatline EEG. And from a signal processing point of view, this is a bit of a burden because it is typically a non-stationary signal. So the systems that interpret the EEG at that point may have some problems. Even a simple spectral analysis will be a little strange in these conditions. So if we take a raw EEG trace and we take a 1 second segment, you can distinguish these slower waves. You can see there are some slower waves, and you can make a sinusoidal wave which has this frequency, and you can determine the microvoltage, the power, or the microvoltage, the square of the microvoltage is the power of the signal. You can determine that, and also you see the smaller peaks which have a higher frequency. You can add that on the original signal. So you can decompose the raw complex EEG in several frequency domains. If you do this for all frequencies between 0 and 30 Hertz, you will see that you get this biphasic wave in a relaxed awake patient. Or slightly, once you get more sedated, you will see that there's an increase of power around the 12 Hertz frequency band. So these are very important. You see also when you have a sedated patient that there's a large peak in the slow wave domain below 2 Hertz, and an increase in the power in the 12 Hertz peak. So of course you need a segment of EEG, let's say 125 milliseconds, and then you make this power analysis to have an idea of the decomposition of the signal. And this is just one moment in time. It's not a dynamic plot. So, but we can make it a dynamic plot by taking the graph and repeating the analysis every 128 milliseconds. And we plot all these graphs next to each other. And additionally, if we add some color plots where a high power zone becomes more red and a low power zone becomes more blue, then you can change this signal, one momental spectral analysis into a time-based monitoring setting. So you can make a two-dimensional figure of it where you see zones, then you have the time in the x-axis, and you see the frequencies in the y-axis, and so the colors on certain frequencies indicate the power. And you can, so that way, if you put this on a screen, you can see the changing power spectrum over time. This is called a spectrogram. And indeed, if you have an awake patient here that is put into an anesthetic state, you see an increase in the power, more reddish zone around the 12 Hertz, and an increase in the power of the slow waves. So this is a sign of the anesthetic state. And of course, this complex EEG becomes much more visual, much more easy to interpret. This is old stuff. This has been done for decades, and it's just the way we are looking at EEG for several reasons. Here you see the problem with burst suppression. Once you have burst suppression, there are zones of very low power that are suddenly altered with high frequency bursts, and so that you get this chaotic image in the spectrogram. And many manufacturers who show spectrograms on their monitors, they just make a blank screen on that point, and they do not use the spectrogram during burst suppression. So is this available in clinical practice now? Yes, it is. There are several monitors already on the market who provide adaptive anesthesia indices, but also they give you the option to see the spectrogram on screen. This is an example of the Massimo Root monitor with the PSI extension, which is adaptive anesthesia index. But also if you use a bilateral BIS electrode and you have the BIS Vista monitor, there's one of the screens. If you toggle through the screens, you have one screen who shows a bilateral spectrogram. And this is an enlarged picture. Indeed, you see a patient who was probably awake here and then suddenly fell asleep, and you see the increase in power in the 12 Hertz frequency domain. And also the NeuroWave has such a screen. So there are several possibilities now already to use spectrogram in clinical practice. So why do I present this? This is old stuff, because if you look at a raw EEG wave, it's very hard to see differences between such lines. But but these were evoked by distinctive different products, and if you translate them in spectrogram, you see clear differences. This is the one for propofol. You see this increase in power in the 12 Hz and low frequency bands, which is not available here for the dexmedetomidine sedated patients. There's mainly a slow wave activation and much less this 12 to 15 Hz frequency band activation. It's not present. Also, this is a patient who is left quiet, but if you stimulate the patient, you will see sudden peaks of an awake patient. So there's a arousability capacity with the dexmedetomidine sedation, and this is translated into the spectrogram. Inhaled anesthetics also give a clear increase in the 12 Hz power line. There's a bit of a difference because there's also some power activation between the slow waves and the 12 Hz. And this is for ketamine, where you see a power increase in the gamma band. So there are much more distinct differences in the interpretation of the spectrogram when you use a spectrogram instead of looking to the raw EEG. Why do I find this very interesting? Because the neuroscientific understanding of how anesthesia works has improved, and we have identified a complex network of nuclei who are involved in anesthesia, in the anesthesia state. And not to go into too much detail, propofol has a distinct effect, will inhibit the intercommunication of cortical interneurons, so there will be a decrease of activity on the cortex, and also there is a clear inhibitive GABA-A regulated inhibition of all these deeper nuclei that are also identified with fMRI and other techniques as being important for conscious awareness. So the interesting thing is that the understanding of these interplay of nuclei that are involved during the anesthetic state, they correlate with what we see on the spectrogram, because the activity of the cortex is, there's a kind of interference or interaction between the electrical activity of the deep thalamic nuclei and the cortex. And there's a continuous information transfer from the deeper nuclei to the cortex and back. So there's a kind of loop existing between those two. And in normal conditions, there's quite chaotic information transfer. There's the transformation, the electrical activity between these two parts of the brain is very chaotic. But during anesthesia, during the inhibition of the GABA receptors, you will see a more monotonic electrical activity. There will be a kind of loop. It's like a microphone system. If I put this microphone to the speaker, there will be this sharp sound, and the system will be dysfunctional. This is because there's a small delay in the signal that is entering the box or the amplifier, and it's picked up by the microphone, and there will be a loop. So the system will be dysfunctional, and that's also the case in the brain. The electrical activity becomes resonant, and this resonance has a 12 to 15 Hz frequency. So for the first time, we have a pretty good idea that this power increase that we see on the spectrogram is really the reflection of a neurophysiological process. It is a resonance that is occurring between the thalamus and the cortex with a 12 to 15 Hz frequency. So what we see on the spectrogram is really neurophysiology at play. And this is evoked by propofol. So two distinct features that need to be declared. One I did just now. This is this resonance There's this resonance that occurs between thalamus and cortex, and the system becomes dysfunctional. So that's the 12 to 15 hertz. It can be explained through that, but the slow oscillations, and this was the part that Professor Schneider was going to talk about, is a reflection of the intercortical communication. Also, the research group of George Masur has done a lot of work on this, and he has extracted a mathematical way of translating this communication transfer between parietal parts of the brain and frontal parts of the brain, or an occipital part of the brain and frontal part of the brain. There's a continuous exchange of information, and we can capture that mathematically. And this is the research group of George Masur. I just added this for a reference. If you are interested in this, in the mathematics of it, feel free to look it up. It's quite a tough lecture. But just in human terms, what is happening is also that in normal communication there will be a kind of synchronicity between the parietal part of the brain, which is in fact the sensory cortex, and the frontal part of the brain where the association areas are located. And apparently, if you use inhaled anesthetics or propofol or even ketamine, there's a quite distinctive moment of loss of responsiveness that is identifiable by a loss of transfer of information from the parietal side of the brain to the frontal side of the brain. And there is a certain asynchronicity occurring in this communication, which correlates with loss of responsiveness. There's more and more data available that this might be also a neurophysiological based measurement in the EEG that is closely correlated to the moment of loss of consciousness. Of course, this has only been proven in very in laboratory conditions, in very controlled conditions. It still remains EEG. It's very vulnerable for EMG interferences and all kinds of electrical interferences. It needs to be shown that this is a feasible way of looking at EEG for the clinical practice. But it gives you a more subjective feel on what's happening in the brain. It's more complex also than a single number, like in a BIS index number. For me, the BIS index has a very good correlation with drug concentration. And it allows me to distinguish a sensitive patient, in the average population, a sensitive patient, from a resistant patient. And it helps me to adjust my drug dose. But it's not really based on a neurophysiological process, it's statistics. And this way, I think we need to evolve to a combination of both. I think the single indices certainly have a value for titrating our drugs better, but understanding the EEG better will also make it more clinical logic to use it. Still, there are some other aspects of this technology. I showed you that in lower dose isoflurane anesthesia, there is indeed a very comparable EEG pattern between propofol and isoflurane. But if you increase the dose of isoflurane, you will see this kind of bridging effect between the low frequencies and high frequencies. At the time that this lecture was made up, not made up, it was it was when this lecture was prepared, thank you, there was not really a good explanation for this, but only recently, I think last month, there was a good publication of an fMRI study in controlled sevoflurane step-up anesthesia, where you really see a different pattern in inhibition of the brain structures with inhaled anesthetics versus propofol. In propofol, there's a much more strong inhibition of the deeper nuclei, and apparently during inhaled anesthesia, the sensory activity on the sensory cortex is maintained much more than with propofol. It's a distinct difference, and so again, probably this reflects the difference between both. And it was shown that this fill-in effect was also seen with sevoflurane. In higher concentrations, there's even this very thick layer of high power in the low frequencies. Also, desflurane had the same pattern, so there's some consistency. Also, I showed you the slide of dexmedetomidine, which is a completely different drug. It does not inhibit the arousal capacity of the brain. So the patient is sedated if you leave him alone, but if you stimulate the patient, he will be awake and responsive. And also this is translated. Here you see very clearly a patient who was sedated with dexmedetomidine, and every time the patient was stimulated, you see that he was, well, when he fell asleep, you saw the alpha powers being higher, and suddenly when he woke up, it disappeared again, and then he fell asleep again, it disappeared again. So there are some, this is also, if we understand the spectrogram better, we might end up with a much more clinical relevant way of looking at EEG. I'm just skipping a little. This is also the ketamine, works completely different. It has much more activating power, will lead to a kind of epileptogenic high frequency activity with high gamma band activity. It's a completely different drug, of course, and this is also reflected in the spectrogram. What was also well explored by the group of Emery Brown is the age effect on the spectrogram. If you look at the middle, at a 30-year-old patient, you see the typical features that I showed you before in all the idealized spectrograms that I showed you. Because in clinical practice there's probably much more noise than the slides that are shown here. But this is the ideal situation that I explained before. But if you look at the age effect, the older you become, and this is not a geriatric patient, 75 years, you already see a diminished alpha power. And this is because the microvoltages of your brain are decreasing. And a system that does not adjust his settings for measuring EEG will even end up with an 81-year-old who has no power amplification in the 12 Hertz. But if you would change your settings, if you change your window where you look at the EEG, you will see that there's also a 12 to 15 Hertz increase in the power. But due to the fixed settings of these spectrograms, the visual impression of the 12-15 Hertz power increase disappears. So the age is a problem for EEG. And if you look at the other side of the spectrum, the 3-year-olds, children have very high voltages of EEG. And so there's a almost continuous high power spectrogram seen on children. And this explains why a single number for all patients that translates depth of anesthesia or the hypnotic effect on the cortex is a problem. You see that children, if you use a BIS in children, you see BIS numbers of 60, 65, 70 in a perfectly anesthetized child. And that's just because these high powers are not implemented in the basic algorithms of today. So there's room for improvement for the algorithms. I think I will skip some of these things, but I think, so just, what can we expect? I think this is, will the idea of the spectrogram or this transfer of communication that is lost between parietal and frontal leads, we are trying to develop mathematical approaches to have a workable system in clinical practice to translate this knowledge towards our common anesthesia practice. But there's a lot of validation that still needs to be done. And an OR is really a tough place to do EEG monitoring, and we will probably see problems with EMG, with all kinds of interferences. But I still believe that we should start with fundamental research and still keep on doing the measurements, and it leads to better understanding. A better understanding and a better comprehension of how we can implement this in our clinical practice. I think I will stop here at this point. I think my key message has been made, and I hope I was a worthy replacer of Professor Schneider.